Chapter 1 of HalfPast Bedtime. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Chenevert. HalfPast Bedtime by H. Bashford. Chapter 1, Mr Jugg. The name of the town doesn't really matter, but it was a big town in the middle of the country, and the first of these adventures happened to a little girl whose Christian name was Marian. She was only 7 when it happened to her, so that it was rather a young sort of adventure, but the older ones happened later on, and this is the best, perhaps, to begin with. Marian's house was in a street called Peter Street, because there was a church in it called St. Peter's Church, and some people liked this church because it had a great spire soaring up into the sky. But Marian's daddy didn't like spires, because they were so sharp and so slippery. He liked towers better, because the old church towers, he said, were like little laps ready to catch God's blessing. But Marian's daddy was a queer sort of man, and nobody took much notice of what he said. At the other end of Peter Street there was a field in which some people were beginning to build houses, and Marian used to love going into this field to watch the builders at work. But one afternoon she became tired of watching them, and so she climbed over a gate into the next field. Here the grass was so tall that it tickled Marian's chin. There were great daisies in it, taller than the grass, and they looked into Marian's eyes. They had calm faces, like Marian's mummy's Nurney's face, and they didn't mind a bit when Marian picked them. There were also buttercups, shiny and fat, like the man in the butcher's shop who was always smiling. This was such a big field that when Marian came to the middle of it, the voices of the builders were quite faint, and the tinkle of their trowels on the edges of the bricks sounded like sheep bells a long way off. When she turned round she could see the roofs of the houses and the tops of the chimneys, and the spires of the churches, all trembly because of the heat, as if they were tired and wanted to lie down. But they couldn't lie down, although they were so much older and bigger and stronger than Marian. "I'd rather be me," thought Marian, and when she had picked a bundle of flowers she lay down in the deep grass. It was so hot that, when once they had become used to her, the stalks of the grasses stood quite still. She could see hundreds and hundreds of them, like trees in a forest or people in church waiting for the anthem. Up in the hills it was different. There the grasses were always moving, not running about, of course, but standing in the same place and bending to and fro, to and fro. Some of them would move, so her father had once told her, as much as 4 miles in a single day, just as far as it was from Marian's house to the top of Fairbarrow Down. But here in the valley they weren't moving at all. They weren't even whispering. They were holding their breath, and if they were listening to anything, it was to something that a little girl couldn't hear. She stared into the sky, but it was so blue that it made her eyes ache trying to see how blue it was, and when she closed them to give them a rest, she could see little patterns on her eyelids. Then she opened them again, and the green of the grass, as she looked between the grass blades, was cool like an ointment. "And nobody in the world," she thought, "knows where I am." She felt a sort of tickle in the middle of her stomach. "How do you do?" said a voice. Marian gave a jump. She saw a little man looking up at her. He was not even as tall as an afternoon tea table. "What's your name?" he asked. He was very polite. He held his hat in his right hand. Marian told him her name. She wasn't a bit frightened. "What's yours?" she asked. "I'm Mr Jugg," he said. "And who are you, Mr Jugg?" she inquired. "I'm the king of the Bumpies," he replied. When Marian was puzzled, there came a little straight line exactly in the middle between her 2 eyebrows. "What are Bumpies?" she said. "My hat!" he gasped. "Haven't you ever heard of Bumpies?" Marian shook her head. Oh dear, he sighed. "Have you ever heard of angels?"
"Well, of course," said Marion. "Everybody's heard of angels." "Well, then, Bumpies," said Mr Jugg, "are baby angels. They're called Bumpies till they've learned to fly." "I see," said Marion. "But why are they called Bumpies?" "Because they bump," said Mr Jugg, not knowing how. Marion laughed. "Where do you live?" she asked. "If you'd care to come with me," he said, "I could show you." "Oh, I should love to," said Marion. "May I?" He put on his hat and gave her his hand, and helped her to stand up with her bunch of daisies. "Come along," he said, and he took her across the field, and through a hole in the hedge into the next one. This was a smaller field with some cows in it, and the grass in it was quite short. He led her across it and helped her over a gate into the field beyond, where the grass was shorter still. "How old are you?" he asked. "I'm 7," said Marion. "That's very young," he replied. "I'm 7,000,000." "Good gracious!" said Marion. "And how old is Mrs Jugg?" "She's as old as I am," he said, "but she looks younger." When they came to the middle of this field he stood still and stamped with his foot 3½ times, 3 big stamps and a little stamp, and then the field suddenly opened. Marion saw a hole at her feet, with a lot of steps in it going down, down, down. "This is where I live," he said. "You needn't be frightened. It's quite safe. I'll lead the way." He was still holding her hand, and he went down before her a step at a time, very carefully. "Isn't it rather dark?" said Marion. "Wait till I've shut the door," he said, "and then you'll get a surprise." When both their heads were well below the ground, he tapped twice on the wall, and then the hole was shut, so that they couldn't see the sky, and a most wonderful thing happened. They were at the beginning of a long passage, almost a mile long, with a lovely slope in it, and on each side of it there were hundreds of little lights, all of different colors. There were blue lights, and green lights, and yellow lights, and crimson lights, and lights of all sorts of other colors that Marion had never seen or even imagined. Both the walls and the floor of the passage were quite smooth, and just where they stood there was a little cupboard. "This is where I keep my scooter," he said. "It saves time, and there's lots of room on it for 2. He opened the cupboard door and took out a scooter. "Now put your hands," he said, "on my shoulders." "Oh, what fun!" said Marion, as she suddenly noticed that he seemed to have grown taller. She climbed on to the scooter behind him. He gave a little push, and they began to glide down the passage. At first they went quite slowly, because the slope was so gentle, but soon they were going faster and faster, and presently they went so fast that all the colored lights became 2 streaks of light, one on each side of them. Marion could hardly breathe. "What's going to happen at the end?" she thought. But about halfway along the passage began to go uphill again. The colored streaks became separate lights. The scooter went slower and slower. At last it stopped just in front of a closed door, and there in the wall was another little cupboard. "Here we are," said Mr Jugg, putting the scooter away. "I expect they're all having tea." Then he opened the door, and Marion almost lost her breath again, for what she saw was a great long room with lots and lots of little tables in it, and Bumpies sitting on chairs round every table. Hanging from the ceiling of this room were hundreds of colored lights, just like the lights that she had seen in the passage. Blue lights, and green lights, and yellow lights, and crimson lights, and lights of all sorts of other colors, of which she didn't even know the name. And there was such a clamor of talking and laughing, and spoon clinking, and plate clinking, and chair creaking, and table creaking, that Marion could hardly hear what Mr Jugg was saying, although he was shouting in her ear. "That's my wife," he said. "That's Mrs Jugg, that lady over there, just coming toward us." Marion looked where he was pointing, and saw a stout little lady with a smiling face. She was exactly as tall as Mr Jugg, but she weighed 2½ pounds more. As for the Bumpies, They were of all sorts of sizes, but they all wore the same kind of clothes: little dark green jackets over little dark green vests, little dark green knickers, and little dark green socks. Fastened to each jacket were two little hooks, one behind each shoulder. These were for their wings. But they only wore wings when they were having their flying lessons. Suddenly they all stopped talking and stared at Marian. Some of them stood on their chairs in order to see her better. She felt very shy and began to blush. Mrs. Jugg came and gave her a kiss. "This is Marian," said Mr. Jugg. "Can you give her some tea?" "Why, of course I can," said Mrs. Jugg, giving Marian 2 more kisses. "Come with me, my dear. You shall have tea at my table." She introduced Marian to all the Bumpies. They gave her 3 cheers, and then went on with their tea, and soon Marian was having tea herself. Such a tea as she had never had before, not even at her Uncle Joe's. There was bread and butter with Bumpy jam on it, and Bumpy Devonshire cream on top of the jam, and there was Bumpy cake with Bumpy cherries in it, and there were Bumpy meringues, and there was Bumpy honey. "Why, it's just like a birthday tea," said Marian. "That's because it is one," said Mr. Jugg. "Every tea's a birthday tea down here. There are so many Bumpies, you see, that it's always somebody's birthday." "Dear me," said Marian, "but isn't that rather a bother, I mean for you and Mrs. Jugg?" Mrs. Jugg gave her another meringue. "There aren't any bothers," she said, "in heaven." "But this isn't heaven," said Marian. "Is it?" "Well, of course it is," said Mrs. Jugg. "Part of it." "But it's under the ground," said Marian. "Well, never mind. Heaven's everywhere, only most people don't know it." Marian was surprised, but she felt all lovely and shivery. Fancy heaven being so near home! What a thing to be able to tell Mummy! Mrs. Jugg gave her some more cake. Some of the Bumpies were finished now and were getting impatient. Presently Mr. Jugg clapped his hands. Then they all stood up, and Mrs. Jugg said grace, and then they all rushed toward the door. This wasn't the door by which Marian had come in, but a door that opened into another room, a great big room with even more lights in it, and hundreds of swings and all sorts of rocking horses. In less than a minute there were Bumpies upon every one of them, and 2 of the Bumpies took charge of Marian. She had a lovely swing and a ride on a rocking horse, and then they all began to play games. They played Ring-a-Ring-a-Roses, and Bumpy in the Corner, and Bumpy Hide and Seek, and Angel's Buff, and then Mr. Jugg took her into the flying school to see some of the older Bumpies fly. This was like a big gymnasium, with lots and lots of pegs in it, and a pair of wings hanging from each peg, and on the floor there was great soft mattresses, so that the Bumpies shouldn't hurt themselves if they fell down. But the Bumpies that Marian saw had almost learned to fly. They would soon be proper angels and able to fly anywhere. "And then," said Mr. Jugg, "they'll be going into upper school to learn history and geography, and all about dreams and things." "Where's the upper school?" asked Marian. "Oh, it's all over the place," said Mr. Jugg. "There are ever so many classrooms, you see, and then they go to college." "And what happens then?" asked Marian. "Well, then they're able to begin to work. There's always heaps for them to do." "I see," said Marian, "and now I really think that I ought to be going home." "Perhaps you ought," said Mr. Jugg. He led her back into the playroom, and then into the room where they had all had tea. The tables had been cleared now, and Mrs. Jugg came toward them with a big box of Bumpy chocolates. Marian took one, and Mrs. Jugg kissed her and told her that she must be sure to come again. "You haven't seen half the place," she said, "nor a quarter of it. There are miles and miles of it. Have another chocolate." Then Marian thanked her and gave her a kiss, and Mr. Jugg opened the door, and they went into the passage. When they had come this part of the passage had been uphill, but going back, of course, it was downhill. He opened the cupboard and took out the scooter, and Marian stood behind him with her hands on his shoulders. Just as before, they began to go quite slowly, but soon they were going as fast as ever. Just as before, the colored lights became two streaks of light, one on each side of them. But Marian knew now what was going to happen, and presently the scooter went slower and slower. At last it stopped just at the foot of the steps, and Mr Jugg put it away in the cupboard. He hit the wall twice, and there, at the top of the steps, Marian saw the hole open and the sky above it. "Goodness me!" she said, "how late it is!" The sky was quite dark, and the stars were shining. Mr Jugg blew his nose. "Poor Mummy," she said, "she will be so frightened." "Where do you live?" asked Mr Jugg. Marian told him. "I'd better fly you there," he said. "Have a tick." He went down the steps again and opened the little cupboard, and came back with a pair of wings. "Now, if you can get on my back," he said, "we'll be home in half a minute." She climbed onto his shoulders just as if she were going to ride pickaback, and then he gave a little jump, and they were up in the air. They skimmed across the fields and down Peter Street just as fast as an express train. At Marian's door he put her down. "Which is your bedroom window?" he asked. She told him. "Now I must be saying good night," he said. "No, I won't come in. It's against the rules for the king of the Bumpies." So he took off his hat and made her a little bow, and before she could wink almost, he was gone. Then she knocked at the door, and next moment Mummy was hugging her as tight as tight. Then Daddy came and hugged her too, and Cuthbert, who had gone to bed, looked over the landing banisters. "Where have you been?" he asked. "Why, where haven't I been?" said Marian, and then she told them all about it. Cuthbert didn't believe her, but Cuthbert didn't believe anything. He was 9 years old and was beginning to learn French. But Mummy believed her, and Daddy believed her, and I'll tell you another thing that happened. Late that night, when everybody was asleep, Mr Jugg flew to Marian's window. Marian's angel (everybody has a guardian angel) was smoking a quiet cigarette on the sill outside. "Hello," he said. "Fancy seeing you here." He had once been a Bumpy, you see, and Mr Jugg had taught him to fly. "Good evening," said Mr Jugg. "What do you think of this?" It was a little dream that he had brought for Marian. "By George," said the angel, "that's a beauty." He slipped it very softly under Marian's pillow. She must have dreamed it too, for next morning when Mummy made her bed it wasn't there. But alas, the loveliest dreams of all are the ones we never remember. Like the jungle he lives in, Tiger wears a dappled skin. Foxes on the plains of snow, white as their surroundings go. So do fishes lose their sight, buried in the ocean's night, little knowing lovely day lies but half a mile away. For the truth is plain to see, as our haunts are, so are we, and in cities you will find busy blind men just as blind. Long ago they lost their eyes under bags of merchandise, and they know not there are still angels on the window sill. End of chapter 1. Past Bedtime by H. Bashford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. Gwendolyn. Living in the same town as Marian there was a little girl called Gwendolyn. Marian didn't know her very well, though they went to the same school and sometimes smiled at each other in church. Her father and mother were always climbing mountains and lecturing about them afterward, so Gwendolyn had to live with her aunt, who was very rich and wore a lot of rings. In many ways Gwendolyn was a nice girl, but she had an exceptionally large tummy. Some people said that it was her own fault, because she was always sitting about eating marzipan, but some people said that she couldn't help her tummy and had to eat a lot to keep it full. There were also people who said that her aunt spoiled her, being so greedy herself and always eating buttered toast. Gwendolyn's aunt had a pale, proud face, deeply lined by indigestion, and she lived in a big house on the right-hand side of Bellington Square. The color of this house was a yellowish cream, and it had 2 pillars in front of the front door. There were 11 steps leading up to it, and there was a boy to open it who wore 12 brass buttons. In the middle of this square there was a sort of garden with tall iron railings all round it, and each of the people living in the square had a key to open the gate of it. It was the tidiest garden in the whole world, and all the flowers in it stood in rows, and the people in the square paid for a gardener to shave the grass every day. One of the reasons why the people in the square were so rich was that they had so few children, and the children that they did have had to be very careful not to make footmarks on the grass. Gwendolyn's aunt sometimes went there when she had a headache and wanted to throw it off, and Gwendolyn went there to eat marzipan and read about princes and princesses. She generally sat on a painted iron seat in front of a flower bed shaped like a lozenge, and once she was sick behind a bush called B. stenophilia on a tin label. One day she was sitting on this seat when she heard a curious sort of sound. At first it was rather faint, so that she didn't take much notice of it, but gradually it became louder and louder. Her aunt was sitting on the same seat, wondering which of her medicines to take before dinner, and Gwendolyn noticed that she began to look annoyed, because the noise was the sound of a harmonium. Some people like harmoniums, and have them in their houses, and play hymns on them on Sunday afternoons. But this was a harmonium that went on wheels, with a man to push it, and a woman walking beside him. After he had pushed it for a few yards he would sit down and play a tune on it, while the woman walked up and down, looking at people's windows and trying to catch their eye. If she saw anybody she would say, "Kind lady," or "Kind gentleman," as the case might be, and perhaps the kind lady or the kind gentleman would throw her some money, and then she would say, "God bless you." But people like that, with traveling harmoniums, weren't allowed to come into Bellington Square, and Gwendolyn's aunt said, "Dear me, just when I wanted a little peace and quiet." If there had been anybody near, such as a policeman or a gardener, she would have told him to send the musicians away, but it was very hot, and there was nobody about, and so the people went on playing. Gwendolyn watched them for a while through the railings, and the butler at number 10 gave the woman a sixpence. Her aunt was very angry about it when Gwendolyn told her, for what was the good of making rules, she said, if you encouraged people to break them? The people with the harmonium came a little nearer, and then Gwendolyn could see what they looked like. The woman was stout, with a hard brown face and rolling eyes like dark-colored pebbles. When she smiled it was as if she had pinned it on, and as if the smile didn't really belong to her. The man had pale eyes like those of ferrets in a hutch, and he watched the woman all the time he was playing. Gwendolyn noticed that there was a long string fastened to one of the handles of the harmonium. She heard a little voice very close to her knees. "Oh, Gwendolyn," it said, "save me." Gwendolyn looked down and saw the unhappiest little face that she had ever seen in her life. It belonged to a small brown monkey wearing a red jacket and a blue sailor hat. He was staring up at her with timid, dark eyes. "I heard your aunt speak to you," he said, "so I know your name." He looked over his shoulder at the man and the woman, but the woman was looking at the houses, and the man was watching her. "What's the matter?" said Gwendolyn. He was holding on to the garden railings. "Lift up my jacket," he said, "and you'll see." Gwendolyn stooped down and lifted up his jacket. There were 3 great wounds across his back. "Oh, dear!" she cried. "How did you get those?" "They beat me," he said. "They're always beating me." Gwendolyn may have been lazy, and she may have been greedy, but she had a soft heart, and the monkey had seen this. "Oh, how dreadful!" she said. "But when did you learn to talk?" The monkey shivered a little. "Hush! They don't know," he replied. "I've lived with them so long that I've learned their language." "But why don't you run away?" asked Gwendolyn. "How can I? They keep me on this string and beat me every night." Gwendolyn thought for a moment. "Oh, Gwendolyn," he said, "do save me if you can." From where she was kneeling Gwendolyn could see the woman going up the steps to one of the houses. The man was watching her as usual. Gwendolyn was half hidden from them by a bush. "But there's my aunt," she said. "I don't know what my aunt would say." "Listen," said the monkey. "I could take you to a lovely island." Gwendolyn frowned a little. "But I don't know," she said, "that my aunt's very fond of islands." "She would be of this," said the monkey. "What's your aunt fondest of?" Gwendolyn thought for a moment. "Buttered toast," she said. "Well, it's ever so much nicer," said the monkey, "than buttered toast." Gwendolyn looked at her aunt and then at the monkey. With his sad eyes and shaking limbs, there wasn't much time. In another minute the man and the woman would be moving on. Close beside her, in a little green box, she could see the tops of the handles of the gardener's shears. She took a deep breath. Then she made up her mind. "All right," she said, "I'll see what I can do." She crept to the box and took out the shears. The monkey squeezed himself through the railings. With a beating heart Gwendolyn cut the string, caught up the monkey, and ran to her aunt. Her aunt looked up. "Why, what have you got here?" she asked. "He belongs to those people," said Gwendolyn, "with the harmonium." "Oh, oh, save me!" said the monkey. "Save me!" "Look what they've done to him," said Gwendolyn. She lifted the monkey's jacket. Gwendolyn's aunt put on her spectacles. "Dear me!" she said. "But the monkey talks." "Yes," said Gwendolyn. "He's been learning for a long time." The monkey clasped his hands and looked into Gwendolyn's aunt's face. He saw deep down into her, where her good nature was. "If you let me go back to them," he said, "they'll kill me. Oh, lady dear, please help me." Gwendolyn's aunt was rather disturbed. Nothing like this had ever happened to her before. If she took the monkey away, people would call her a thief, but if she let him go back, perhaps he would be beaten to death. "Where do you live?" she asked. "On Monkey Island. It's the loveliest island in the world." "But how did you come here?" she said. The monkey began to tremble again. "They stole me away," he said, "from my wife and children." "Oh, auntie," said Gwendolyn, "can't we take him back there? He says it's ever so much nicer than buttered toast." Her aunt stood up. "Oh, bother the buttered toast," she said. "It's his wife and babies that I'm thinking about." Then the harmonium suddenly stopped, and they heard the man cry out. "Why, where's that monkey?" he said. He began to swear. They saw the woman run down the steps. The monkey gave a little cry and jumped into Gwendolyn's aunt's arms. Then they saw the man and the woman rush toward the railings. Both their faces were dark as night. "Come on," said Gwendolyn's aunt. "We'll have to run for it. Make for the gate." Fortunately the gate was on the opposite side of the garden, and their own house was opposite the gate. The man and the woman would have to run right round the square. "We ought to beat them," said Gwendolyn's aunt. Oh, how sorry Gwendolyn was then that her tummy was so large. But she ran as fast as ever she could, and almost kept up with her aunt. The man and the woman had started to run too, shouting aloud at the tops of their voices. "We shan't be safe," said her aunt, "till we've got to the island, because we shall really be thieves till we've taken the monkey home." They dashed across the grass and through the gate, and just as they were running up their own front steps, they saw the man and the woman coming into sight round the corner of the railings. They had found a policeman, and he was running with them. "Luckily the servants are out," said Gwendolyn's aunt. She was quite excited, and her eyes were shining. Gwendolyn had never seen her looking so young. As soon as they were safely in the house, she shut the front door and bolted it. "That'll give us another 5 minutes," she said. "Run upstairs and get your hat and overcoat." Gwendolyn ran upstairs, panting and puffing, and fetched her hat and overcoat and her doll, David. Meanwhile, her aunt ran into the study, opened her cash-box, and took out £100. A minute later there came a thunder of knocks and 2 or 3 peals of the front door-bell. "We'll get away," said her aunt, "through the back garden." She had packed up a knapsack and slipped into a raincoat. The knocks were repeated. Rat-tat-tat-tat. They heard angry voices shouting through the letter-box. Gwendolyn's aunt laughed and shook her fist at them. "Come along," she said. "Now for the back garden." From the back garden there was a little door leading into a street behind. Here there was a cab stand, and Gwendolyn's aunt told the cab driver to drive to the station. "We shall be just in time," she said, "to catch the 3:40 train." It was only a horse cab, but the horse galloped, and they arrived at the station just as the train came in. There was hardly a moment to take their tickets in, but the guard waited for them, and they just managed it. The engine whistled, the porter slammed the door, and the next moment they were off. The monkey, who had been hiding under Gwendolyn's aunt's coat, poked his head out and looked about him. Fortunately they had the carriage all to themselves. "Oh dear," said Gwendolyn, "how splendid!" It was an express train, and it didn't stop for an hour, and then Gwendolyn's aunt thought they had better get out. "We'll hire a motor car," she said, "and go to Lullington Bay and find my old friend Captain Jeremy. When I was young he wanted to marry me, but I was too proud and wouldn't let him." So they got out and hired a motor car and drove at full speed to Lullington Bay. It was a long drive, and when they arrived at the captain's cottage the stars were shining, and the captain was in his garden. Deep below them they could see the ocean, dark as bronze and knocking at the shore. Captain Jeremy was looking through a telescope. A stout little sailing ship was anchored in the bay. "Why, Josina," he said, that was Gwendolyn's aunt's name, "fancy seeing you here after all these years." He was a sunburnt man with blue eyes, and Gwendolyn liked him because he looked so kind. They told him what had happened, and he looked very grave. "We must be off at once," he said. "I know that man and woman." "Why, who are they?" asked Gwendolyn. "Smugglers," he said. "They're 2 of the most dangerous people I know. Luckily my ship is all ready to sail. We'll put off at once for Monkey Island." The captain lived alone. He had never been married, so he had only to lock up his carriage and put the key in his pocket. "We ought to get there," he said, "in a couple of months' time, if the wind holds fair." It was the first time that Gwendolyn had been on the sea, and for 2 or 3 days she was rather seasick. But after that she began to enjoy the voyage, and the smell of the spray and the sight of the waves. It was lovely weather, and as they drew near the equator a great yellow moon shone on them all night. It was so hot that she hardly wore any clothes, and used to go barefooted just like the sailors, and she grew so blonde and so graceful that she scarcely looked like the same girl. As for her tummy, well, there was no marzipan on board, and she soon began to lose all her love for it. She would ever so much rather be up in the rigging with David her doll and Captain Jeremy's telescope. One day she suddenly noticed a sort of little cloud on the horizon, but it didn't move, and as the ship drew nearer she saw that the cloud was really an island. She called to the monkey, and he ran up the rigging beside her, and after one look he could hardly contain himself. "That's the island!" he cried. "My beautiful island, with my wife on it and my children." Presently they came so close that they could see the golden sand, and the tall trees with their clusters of fruit, and soon the ship was anchored, and Captain Jeremy gave orders for a boat to be lowered. Captain Jeremy himself, with 2 of his sailors, and Gwendolyn's aunt all got into it, and in another 5 minutes they were standing on dry land again, with the happy monkey dancing beside them. Captain Jeremy and the sailors stayed by the boat, But Gwendolyn and her aunt and the monkey began to explore the island. There were flowers everywhere, not planted in rows like the flowers in Bellington Square, but growing where they liked, and rejoicing in their freedom and praising God with their beautiful colors. Some of the trees were smooth, with curious flat leaves, and knobby brown berries that tasted like buttered toast. But Gwendolyn's aunt had made a resolve to give up eating buttered toast. Since she had helped Gwendolyn to rescue the monkey, all her indigestion had disappeared, and she felt as fresh and looked as pretty as if she were only half her age. Some of the trees were different, with twisted trunks and pale red blossoms dripping with juice, and this juice tasted like marzipan, but Gwendolyn had resolved to give up marzipan. But it was a lovelier island than they had ever imagined, and soon the little monkey gave a cry of joy, and the next moment he was hugging in his arms another little monkey that had dashed to meet him. It was his wife, and just behind her there were two smaller monkeys waiting to be kissed, and Gwendolyn and her aunt could almost have cried to see how happy they all were. For nearly a month they stayed at the island, sleeping on board, but landing every morning, and Gwendolyn learned to swim almost as well as a fish, and to climb trees almost as well as a monkey. But Captain Jeremy wasn't really happy until a big steamer happened to come by with news that the man and the woman had been drowned in a storm on their way to try and catch Gwendolyn and her aunt. It was now October, and by the time they arrived home Gwendolyn would have been away from school for a term and a half, so they said good-bye to the monkey and his family, and set sail from the island. Gwendolyn cried a little, and so did her aunt, but on the way home an odd thing happened, for Captain Jeremy asked her aunt to marry him, and they had to think a lot about the wedding. They decided to get married on Christmas Day, and when Gwendolyn's school friends saw her as a bridesmaid, she had grown so tall and straight and happy-looking that they wondered what on earth could possibly have happened to her. "Sailor, sailor, what's the song that you sing the whole day long?" And the sailor said to me, "Birth's the jetty, time's the sea, death's the harbor, life's the trip, hope's the pilot, you're the ship. Sailor, sailor, tell me true, what's beyond those waters blue?" But the sailor shook his head. "That's a secret, sir," he said. End of chapter 2. HalfPast Bedtime by H. Bashford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. The Little Icemen. Marian's daddy was very glad when Captain Jeremy married Gwendolyn's aunt, because he and Captain Jeremy had been boys at school together, and he had always been very fond of him. And he was gladder still when Captain Jeremy and Gwendolyn's aunt left Bellington Square. They did this a week after the wedding, because Captain Jeremy hated Bellington Square, and they went to live in an old farmhouse 2 miles out of town. It was a beautiful old house, with a gabled roof and golden red bricks like a winter sunset, and the halls and passages of it were dark and velvety, and the rooms upstairs smelt of lavender. Leading from the road to the front door was a cobbly path, with lawns on each side of it, and big trees standing on the lawns, with low spreading branches that touched the grass. Behind the house was a kitchen garden full of cucumber frames and vegetables, and behind that was an orchard, with a gate leading into the fields. These were all hard and crinkly with frost, and the fruit trees were bare because it was the 2nd of January, but that made the house seem all the snugger with its low-paneled walls and log fires. When they had been in this house a week, Gwendolyn's aunt gave a children's party, and Marian and Cuthbert were asked to go, because their daddy was Captain Jeremy's friend. Marian was very pleased, because she had always liked Gwendolyn, although she had never known her very well. but Cuthbert said that he didn't like her and that he'd rather stay at home. Marian told him how much she had improved since her voyage to Monkey Island, but Cuthbert said that he didn't care, and that she was a silly sort of girl anyhow. He was only pretending, however, because just after Christmas he had been in the hospital having his tonsils out, and he had already missed 2 or 3 parties and didn't mean to miss another. So they went to the party, and Cuthbert was rather glad, because one of the girls there was a girl named Doris, who had been in hospital having her tonsils out at the same time as he. She was rather a decent girl, 10 years old, with dark-colored eyes and brown hair, and one of her thumbs was double-jointed, and she had been 8 times to the seaside. Just at present she was a little pale, and so was Cuthbert himself, and Gwendolyn was so brown that when they stood near her they looked paler still. Captain Jeremy came and shook hands with them.
"Hello," he said. "What's the matter with you?"
"It's their tonsils," said Marion. "They've just had them out, and of course they're a little pulled down." Captain Jeremy examined them thoughtfully. Cuthbert liked him, and so did Doris. "What you want," he said, "is a trip with me. That would soon set you up again." Gwendolyn and Marian had gone off to play, so Cuthbert and Doris had him to themselves. "I should like it very much," said Cuthbert. "So would I," said Doris, "but I'm afraid Mummy wouldn't let me go." "I see," said the captain. "Well, I'm off next week to Port Jacobson in the Arctic Circle, but you wouldn't be able to go to school next term if you came with me, because I shan't be back till the middle of May." Cuthbert put his hand up and pinched his throat. "It's still rather sore," he said. "So is mine," said Doris. Captain Jeremy laughed. "Well, there's nothing like the Arctic Circle," he said, "for people who've just had their tonsils out." Then he spoke to Doris. "Let me see," he said. "I know where Cuthbert lives, but where do you live?" Doris told him that she lived in John Street, which was the next street to Cuthbert's. Her father was dead, and her mummy was rather poor, as she had 5 other children besides Doris. Captain Jeremy nodded. "Then perhaps I shall be able to persuade her," he said, "to let me take you off her hands for a bit." Doris danced up and down. "Oh, I wish you would!" she cried. "I'd simply love to see the Arctic Circle." "So would I," said Cuthbert, and they were both so excited that they could hardly eat any tea. When Marian heard about it, she wished that she was pale too, and she wished it ever so much more the next morning, when Captain Jeremy called on her father and mother and persuaded them to let Cuthbert go. Then he went to John Street and talked to Doris's mother, and he looked so commanding and yet so gentle that Doris's mother said she would be very glad to let Doris go with him to Port Jacobson. "Of course it'll be very cold," he said, "and they'll have to wear furs, but we can easily get those when we arrive, and all they'll want for the voyage is plenty of underclothing and their oldest clothes." For a voyage like that, all among the ice, Captain Jeremy's sailing ship wasn't quite suitable, so he had hired a little steamer with very thick sides and a trusty pilot. Port Jacobson was in a sort of bay just under the shelter of Cape Fury, and beyond Cape Fury the coast had hardly been explored. It was all so bare and bleak and rocky. The only people who lived there were a few fishermen, a clergyman named Mr Smith, and a couple of engineers, who had been there for a year and had just found a coal mine. It was the engineers who had written to Captain Jeremy, because they wanted him to bring them some machinery, and also because they wanted him to take back some of the coal that they had already dug up. That was how Captain Jeremy made his living, fetching and carrying things across the sea. Neither Cuthbert nor Doris was the least bit seasick, and they loved to stand on the bridge beside Captain Jeremy and see the great billows rushing toward the steamer, one after another, in the bright sunshine. Sometimes they went below into the dark engine room, where they had to shout to make themselves heard, and where the pistons of the engines slid to and fro like the arms of boxers that never got tired. How they loved the cabin, too, at meal times, when the cook rolled in with the steaming dishes, and what meals they ate, in spite of the lurching table and the water slamming against the portholes. In a couple of days' time they had forgotten all about their tonsils, and 2 days after that they had almost forgotten their homes, and a week later they saw something in the distance like the gray ghost of a cathedral. It was an iceberg, the first that they had seen, but soon they began to see them every day, sometimes pale in mournful groups, like broken statues in a cemetery, and sometimes sparkling in the sun as though they were crusted with 1,000,000 diamonds. One day they came on deck just after breakfast and saw miles and miles of ice all jumbled together, and 3 hours later they saw a great cliff covered with snow standing out to sea. That was Cape Fury, and as they drew nearer they could see a little cluster of dark houses with spires of smoke rising from their chimneys, and that was Port Jacobson. The pilot was on deck now, shouting all the time, and the steamer was going very slowly, with ice on each side of it, and they could see some men coming toward them with rough-haired dogs pulling sledges. At last the steamer could get no farther, although it was still about a mile from the town, and they cast out anchors and a long cable that they began to carry toward the shore. It seemed very funny to Cuthbert and Doris to feel their feet again on something steady, even though this was only the rough surface of the frozen bay in front of the port. The days were so short here that the sun was already low, and the great cape stood dark and menacing, while far inland they could see the peaks of mountains slowly fading against the sky. Among the men who had come to meet them were the 2 engineers and Mr. Smith, and they were very surprised to see Cuthbert and Doris running about on the ice and trying to make snowballs. Then they all set off toward the little town, with the lights shining in its windows, and Mr. Smith said that they must stay with him, because he and Mrs. Smith had no children. Captain Jeremy was to stay with the 2 engineers, who had built a little house of their own, but they all came in to supper with the Smiths, and Cuthbert and Doris were allowed to sit up. "Tomorrow," said Mr. Smith, "we'll get you some furs, and then you'll be able to go tobogganing with the other children." And Cuthbert and Doris said "Hooray!" because they had learned to toboggan on Fairbarrow Down. Just before they went to bed they saw a wonderful thing, for the whole of the sky began to quiver, and beautiful colors went dancing across it, melting away and then coming back again. These were the Northern Lights, or the Aurora Borealis, and Cuthbert and Doris could have watched them all night. But they soon fell asleep, and most of the next day they were out tobogganing with the other children, and they soon became so good at it that they could go as fast as any of them, and hardly ever had a spill. By the end of the week they had got into the habit of climbing on to the top of Cape Fury and tobogganing back again, more than 1.5 miles, right down to Mr. Smith's house. The first time they climbed up there, the slope had looked so steep, and the roofs of the houses so far below them, that they had stood for nearly 10 minutes before they could make up their minds to start. But some of the other children had done it, and at last Doris had said, "Well, come on, Cuthbert, we mustn't be afraid," and Cuthbert had told her to hold on tight, and so they had pushed off over the frozen snow. By the time they had got halfway they were going so fast that the air was roaring in their ears, but the track was straight, and they had kept in the middle of it, and ran safely into the town. After that it didn't seem worth while to go tobogganing on any of the lower hills, and that was how it came about that the following Wednesday they found themselves as usual on the top of Cape Fury. It was a still, cold day, and the air was so clear that they could see the coast for miles and miles, and the tops of the mountains far inland that they had never seen before. Below them in the bay, stuck in the ice, they could see the little steamer, with the sailors on the deck, and beyond the ice a strip of blue water, and beyond that again more ice still. That was on one side of them, and on the other they saw the farther slope of Cape Fury, slanting down and down and down to the unexplored regions toward the north. It was a gentler slope than the slope toward the town, and suddenly Cuthbert had a great idea. "I say," he said, "why shouldn't we toboggan down there? I don't suppose anybody has ever done it." What with the wind and the sun and the snow, the cheeks of both of them were like ripe chestnuts, and Doris's eyes began to sparkle as she listened to Cuthbert's great idea. When he was at home, Cuthbert didn't get many ideas, and he generally used to laugh at other people's, so he was very pleased when he got this one, and Doris said that she thought it ripping. "We won't go too fast," he said, "so that if we see a precipice or anything, we shall be able to stop ourselves in time." They had a stout little toboggan just big enough for two, and so they started off down this new slope, with the sun shining and the snow glittering. At first they moved quite slowly, but lower down the side of the hill became steeper, and soon they were going so fast that, even if they had wanted to, they would have found it pretty hard to stop themselves. And then an awful thing happened, for suddenly, just in front of them, they saw a deep cleft in the snow, sliding down at a terrific angle into a sort of tunnel under the hillside. Almost before they could breathe, they had plunged into this, and now there was nothing to do but to hold on. They saw the tunnel's mouth leaping toward them, and the next moment they were in darkness. Neither Cuthbert nor Doris had ever been so frightened before. In the pitchy blackness they could see nothing. They could only feel themselves shooting deeper and deeper into the very heart of the frozen earth. Sometimes a bump on the floor of the tunnel would send them careening toward the roof, and then they would come down again with a thud that almost pitched them off the toboggan. Every moment they expected to be killed. There came another tremendous bump, and then they felt their toboggan springing through the air and dropping like a stone into some fearful well. They shut their eyes, waiting for death, and then went rolling over and over, with something strange and soft and feathery wrapping them round like a bedroom quilt. For a minute or two they could only gasp, and then Cuthbert sat up and called to Doris. "Hello, Doris," he said. "Are you all right?" "Yes, I think so," said Doris. "Are you?" Cuthbert told her that he was, and now that they could look about, they saw that they were on the floor of an immense cave, and that they had pitched down from somewhere near the top of it onto a huge mass of feathers. These were evidently the feathers of thousands and thousands of sea-birds, but who could have picked them and stored them here so carefully? Then they heard a strange sort of coughing and grunting and spluttering, and they saw the oddest of little men. He was about 3 feet high, with a red beard and a very cheerful sort of face, and he had evidently been asleep in among the feathers, for he was rubbing his eyes and staring at them in astonishment. Then they heard some more grunting and coughing, and at last they saw a dozen of these little men standing all round them, dressed in the skins of animals, and with feathers sticking to their beards. They were all looking rather disturbed, but when Cuthbert and Doris smiled, they began to smile too, and came toward them. Then they began to talk, and though at first the sounds they made seemed very queer, Cuthbert and Doris, rather to their surprise, found that they could understand them perfectly well. That was because the language in which the little men spoke was the oldest language in the world, the father and mother of all the other languages, and so of course the children soon understood it. They also found that in a very little while they could talk in this language themselves, and soon they were all chattering together about what had happened, as if they had known each other all their lives. Now that they had become used to the dim light, they could see that this great cave had walls of rock, with long icicles hanging from the roof and the sticking out pieces of the walls. Most of the floor of it was smooth ice, but in the middle there was a flat rock, and on this rock there was a little fire burning, a little fire made of coal. The leader of the men was a man called Marmaduke, and he told the children that they had all been asleep, and that they had lived in this cave for hundreds of thousands of years, and that the great pile of feathers was where they went to bed. "But it's daytime," said Cuthbert. "Why do you go to bed in daytime?" Marmaduke laughed, and so did all the other men. "Because at night," he said, "we go out and hunt to get our wolf and seal meat when no one can see us." But they were all so excited at the appearance of Cuthbert and Doris that they led them to the fire, where they sat and talked to them, and presently they cooked a delicious meal for them of seal soup and wolf chops. The coal that they burnt they had found in a deep hole in one corner of the cave, and at the other corner there was a little crack, down which they presently led the children. This opened upon a ledge of ice 5 or 6 feet above the shore, and now they could hardly see anything, because the air was full of snow, driving fiercely into their faces. The little ice men looked grave. "It's a blizzard," they said, "and very likely it'll go on for a week. But luckily we've got plenty of meat, so that we shan't be in want of food." "But how shall we get back?" said Doris. "They won't know where we are, and they'll think that we're both dead." Marmaduke shook his head. "I don't exactly know," he replied, "how you'd get back in any case. You could never climb up the way you came, and it's very difficult to get round the coast." "But we'll have to get back somehow," said Cuthbert, "because of our relations at home." Marmaduke looked puzzled. "What are relations?" he said, "and why should you want to go back?" So Cuthbert had to tell them all about his father and mother and his Uncle Joe and his sister Marion, and Doris had to tell them all about her mummy and her 5 little brothers and her aunts and cousins. They were very interested, but it was quite clear that Cuthbert and Doris couldn't leave that night, and so presently they crept in among the feathers, and were soon very comfy and fast asleep. The next morning it was still snowing, but it was rather fun helping to cook the meals, and the little men showed them some lovely dances that were almost as old as the world itself. For a whole week they had to stay in the cave, with the blizzard raging outside, but one morning when they crept down the crack they found the sky clear and the sun shining. They could now see, towering straight above them, tremendous precipices of rock, and miles of boulders and broken ice stretching out toward the horizon. "Our only hope," said Cuthbert, "is that Captain Jeremy and some of the fishermen will come exploring for us." And just as he said that, far in the distance they heard the report of a gun. Then a long way off they saw some little figures and a tiny sleigh drawn by dogs, and they stood on tiptoe and waved, hoping that Captain Jeremy might see them through his telescope. The little icemen never came out by daylight, and when they heard what the children had seen, they made them promise on their dying oath not to tell anybody the way to the cave. Once before, they said, a learned man had discovered them, and he had tried to measure them with a pair of compasses, so they had had to kill him, as gently as they could, by putting him in the middle of the pile of feathers. Then they said good-bye, and all the little men kissed them and sent their love to everybody at home, and Cuthbert and Doris began to scramble over the ice toward the sledge party that was now much nearer. When Captain Jeremy met them, you can guess how pleased he was, because he had made up his mind that they must have been killed, and good Mr. Smith had tears in his eyes, but they were tears of joy. Everybody at Port Jacobson, too, was so pleased that they made a big bonfire to celebrate the occasion, and they all drank the healths of the little icemen and ate a lot of sweets in their honor. When the children arrived home, however, early in May, and Cuthbert told Marion all about them, she said at first that she wouldn't believe in them, because Cuthbert hadn't believed in Mr. Jugg. But Cuthbert had grown wiser and less conceited, and he told Marion that he had changed his mind. So Marion believed in them, and her daddy was rather pleased, because there were more things under the earth, he said, than most people imagined. Not a twig that learned to climb in the babyhood of time, not a bud that broke the air in the days before men were, not a bird that tossed in flight ere the first man walked upright; not a bee with craftier cell than a Roman citadel, but, with all its pride and pain, into dust crept back again. Oh, what wisdom there must be hidden in the earth and me! Chapter 4